Good morning and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. This webinar is part of our weekly Scholars Hub speaker series from the Alumni Engagement Department, featuring timely, current, and relevant lectures by academics and researchers from York University. Today's session is in addition to our schedule and is in direct response to the most recent acts of anti-Black racism. And while this is not a new issue, it has been punctuated by the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, many others, and by the protests and painful aftermath that has followed. I'm Carrie Williams. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Events here at York University. I lead the team working behind the scenes on these webinars and made a very intentional but not easy decision to take the role as your host today because this is personal. Racism is a reality. It's a reality many of us, myself included, grow up learning to just deal with. Adapting, adjusting, filtering as a means to fit in, to try to ensure acceptance, and in some cases to survive. The widespread reaction to these most recent acts of anti-Black racism is unprecedented. People who identify as Black, people who don't, major companies and brands, organizations engaging in this issue and aligning themselves with the Black Lives Matter movement in ways that we just haven't quite seen. I am so curious about what this reaction means, and we may be able to start to unpack that, but it starts with self-learning, sorry, I've lost my spot here. Self-learning as well as continuing with other learning. This session is intended to be a contribution to your learning. Whether you are already steeped in this work because it's your profession, like the scholars we're going to hear from today, or it's your lived experience, whether you consider yourself to be an ally, or you're taking your first steps in this space, regardless of where you are in that continuum, your learning is an effective tool for change. My hope is the conversations my parents had to have with me about the reality of being a Black girl, the inequities, the potential lack of opportunities. My hope is I don't have to have those same conversations with my own daughters. And so, again, today is about learning. Your learning is an effective tool to change. Before I begin, I want to tell you about York's response to anti-Black racism. Last week, President Linton issued an update to the York community, reiterating the university's commitment to stand together against anti-Black racism. I urge all of you, when you can, to visit yorku.ca/rights and yorku.ca/mental health to learn more about campus clubs, organizations, resources, and services supporting York's commitment to ensure all of our community members, including our alumni, feel safe and welcome. Although we aren't all in the same location, I would still like to acknowledge many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I also acknowledge the history of oppression, injustice, and inequity shared between people of African descent and Indigenous descent here on Turtle Island and around the world. Now, before we begin, we'd like to get to know our audience a bit and ask you some questions. One question, we'd like to take a quick poll. It should appear on your screen. Have you ever attended a York event other than today? That should, yeah, see that's on your screen right now, and we'll just give everyone a moment to respond. Okay, and so thank you so much to everyone for participating in that poll. And we have almost a 50-50 split. More than half of you are new, so welcome. And some of you have joined our lectures before, so welcome back. If you are new to online events, if at any time you need help with this experience, please feel free to click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and enter your question. The team is there and ready to help you. That same button can be used to submit questions throughout the lecture because we are going to have quite a long Q&A period following the lecture. You can submit your questions through there. And for those of you who are watching live on Facebook, please feel free to submit your questions and comments through the comment section for this video, and the team will get them my way. So today's talk is titled, Will This Be the One? Reflection, Engagement, and Action Against Anti-Black Racism in Ontario. I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Uzo Anucha, Provincial Academic Director of YouthREX, York Research Chair in Youth in Context of Inequity, and Associate Professor at the School of Social Work here at York. Welcome. With her is her team, also welcoming Cyril J. Cromwell, Learning and Development Manager, YouthREX, along with Amina Hagar, Clementine Uche, both research assistants with YouthREX, and York University undergraduate students. Welcome all. It's a pleasure having you here with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you for that warm welcome. And on behalf of myself and the entire YouthREX team, that is a youth research and evaluation exchange, I would like to welcome you all to this conversation on dismantling anti-Black racism. I have a few minutes to provide you with a brief overview of YouthREX and of our presentation today. We have structured our presentation into three parts: a reflection explaining anti-Black racism within the 21st century, engagement, which reflects top 10 issues from the Doing Right Together for Black Youth report, and lastly, actions that you can take in your respective fields. This will be all in an attempt to answer the main question guiding our conversation today: will this be the one? YouthREX is a province-wide initiative based at the School of Social Work at York University. Our vision is an Ontario where shared knowledge is transformed into positive impact for all youth. Our mission is to make research, evidence, evaluation practices accessible and relevant for Ontario's youth sector through capacity building, knowledge mobilization, and evaluation leadership. We are funded primarily by the Ministry of Children and Community Social Services. Our stakeholders are youth workers, frontline and management, youth leaders, policymakers, researchers that develop and run community-based programs across Ontario. On our main website, youthrex.com, I would like to highlight two resources that are very helpful for everyone that's joining us today. They're the Knowledge Hub and the Community Board. The Knowledge Hub is really an online library with over 1,000 resources on issues that involve youth, such as education, mental health, substance use, youth engagement, and so much more. We break down knowledge in these areas so that they're easy to understand and accessible. And secondly is the Community Board. The Community Board is really your go-to place for everything that's happening in the youth sector. You can find opportunities such as funding, online webinars, events, jobs, and everything really that's relevant for both youth and youth workers. I hope you can get the chance to visit the website after our conversation today. I am going to hand it over to Amina to get us started on the first part of our conversation. Amina?
Thank you so much, Clementine. I'm going to be going over anti-Black racism in the 21st century and discussing a few statistics. Going over to the next slide, we'll be talking about the first statement that I'll go over is we are encouraged by the widespread anger and grief and anguish and pain of the groundswell of protest. The three questions that we pose are, will this be the one that finally demonstrates that anti-Black racism is real and must be dismantled forever? Will this be the one that makes undeniably visible, will this be the one that makes undeniably visible the metaphoric me on the necks of Black people that anti-Black racism feels like every day? Will this be the one that finally energizes us to dismantle anti-Black racism forever and create a better future for Black youth? Moving forward to the next slide. Anti-Black racism is more than a few bad cops. George Floyd's death, as well as the deaths of so many other unarmed Black people, is a consequence of systems and cultures that treat Black lives as lives that don't matter. The next slide. It is prejudice and attitudes and beliefs that stereotyping and discrimination that is directed at people of African descent, and it is rooted in the unique histories and experiences of enslavement. It is deeply entrenched in Canadian institutions, policies, and practices. It is the normalization that it is normalized and is often rendered invisible to the larger white society. It's manifested in the legacy of current social, economic, and political marginalization of African Canadians in society. In the next slide, I'll be talking about a few statistics that Black Torontonians face. Black Torontonians are victims of 85% of hate crimes in Toronto, where racism was a motivating factor. Within that, there's Black students who, within the education system, there are early leavers of high school. So that means they represent about 23% compared to their white counterparts. And 27% of all carding incidents focus on Black Torontonians. It was 3 times more than the overall population. And lastly, Black women and girls are the fastest growing incarcerated groups in Toronto. Those are staggering numbers. Moving on to the next slide, I'll talk about the consequences of anti-Black racism. It leads to lack of equitable access, outcomes, and opportunities for Black people. Black youth in Ontario experiences proportionate negative outcomes, including unemployment, systems of systemic unemployment, violence, and systemic lack of opportunity. They make up about 41% of youth in Canada they make about 41% of children in care. That's 5 times more than the representation of overall population. And Black boys are 4 times more likely to go to prison compared to their white counterparts. And they represent about 12% of students in the education system, where they're supposed to be safe and learning. Unfortunately, 31% of all suspensions are Black. Black youth represent about 31% of all suspensions. Lastly, I'd like to add that Black youth across the province are unemployed at 2 times the provincial rate. These are staggering numbers. And it's important to look at these stats and realize that it's systemic racism is embedded in our society. I'd like to give it over to Dr. Anuche to go over the engagement portion of our lecture.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amina, for highlighting these disparities and outcomes for Black youth in Ontario, Canada, not the US, but here in Canada. I think sometimes when we think of anti-Black racism, we forget that there are actually real life consequences, such as those that you've so clearly outlined. So thank you for highlighting those. As we reflect on this moment we are in, and collectively commit ourselves to making sure that this moment is the one that finally dismantles anti-Black racism. I think it's really important that we become better informed about the long-standing issues and demands from Black youth and communities including the kind of stats I just reminded us of. As a starting point, of course, I suggest that you should check out our visual reports, Doing Right Together for Black Youth, to learn about the experiences of Black youth and their families in Ontario with anti-Black racism, in addition to countless other reports that have systematically researched and documented these disparities for Black youth. YouthREX has curated many of them in our knowledge hub that Clementine mentioned at the beginning, and I think we're going to put the link in the chat function. Next slide, please. Next slide, Ben. Okay. Reading and for me personally, and reading and reviewing reports like Doing Right Together for Youth is not just a review of literature. I know review of literature is an academic exercise, but that's not just what this is. This is really about bearing witness to the cultural, political, and socioeconomic cruelty of anti-Black racism. You'll notice when you review these reports that these disparities, they coexist with a very long history of Black youth being labeled as troubled and troubling, as problems, and as dangerous to society. If we're going to commit to dismantling racism forever, I think it's important that we become better informed about the long-standing issues and demands from Black youth and communities. For this reason, we're really eager to share some of the key findings from these reports. Next slide, please. Yeah. Because we really want to spend time with you, bearing witness to the issues described in the reports, and then having a dialogue about what kinds of actions can dismantle anti-Black racism. I'm not going to get into all the methodology of the report. I'm just going to quickly note that the report is based on input from over 1,500 community members across the GTA, Ottawa, and Windsor. They all came out to participate in community engagement sessions that were organized by the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, or they sent in written submissions and to inform the development of the Ontario Black Youth Action Plan. I'm not sure if people remember that in February 2017, the Ontario government launched the Black Youth Action Plan to tackle the barriers that Black youth in Ontario face. Sitting here now in 2020, after COVID, it seems like that was a lifetime ago. So over 1,500 community members came out for this. Next slide, please. After a very collaborative and community engaged process of analyzing and trying to make sense of the data that was generated from all these consultations, we selected the top 10 issues that we felt bears witness to what these 1,500 people that came out, they included parents, youth, guardians, aunties, uncles, activists. They packed these consultations. I remember attending a couple and they were packed. People were so eager to talk, to share their experiences of anti-Black racism. Next slide, please. Yeah. What we did was to, and it wasn't an easy process, and it included a lot of back and forth consulting with community members that we felt could help us contextualize some of these findings within previous consultations that have been had. We selected what we call the top 10 issues for Black youth. Those top 10 issues, we felt that they represented the important issues that came out for people. Next slide. What we're going to do is each of us will take a couple of these issues and briefly talk about them, but I still encourage you to check out the full report yourself so you can hear the voices, see some of the quotes, see an elaboration of why they felt the way they felt, and then we'll try to integrate that by pulling in things that come from previous consultations. I'm going to look at, sorry, the slide before. I'm going to look at the first three ones. The first issue was the widespread anti-Black racism that community members described that runs through all of Ontario's institutions and systems, including the educational system, the child welfare system, the criminal justice system, the labor markets. No system, frankly, was spared. The feedback they provided stretched across all these systems. They described how anti-Black racism also interlocks with other structures of oppression, such as the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, and how all this shape the unique experiences of Black youth. For example, Muslim and male Black youth, they are subjected to increased criminalization, while gender shapes the ways in which female Black youth are constructed as over-sexualized. The second top 10 issue was that Black excellence is not recognized. Canadian society still doesn't recognize the achievements, successes, contributions, hopes, dreams of Ontario's Black communities. This lack of recognition stems from a very deficit-based view of how Canadian society understands Black children, youth, and their communities, one that magnifies all the shortcomings and then undervalues the assets. I still remember a couple of the quotes from youth. They talked about the only time they ever get to see anyone that looks, to hear anything that sounds like is positive about the Black community is during Black History Month. Their school might bring in a guest speaker or two, and then after that, there is an invisibility of what the contributions of Black communities are. The third issue they talked about was the lack of Black representation in leadership roles. They were quite clear that this lack of representation is a consequence of systemic racism in education and the labor markets. Whenever I bear witness to this lack of representation of Black people in leadership roles in Ontario, and I think most institutions are not exempt from this, including ours, York University, I think of that saying that if you're not at the table, you'll be on the menu, right? Because Black people are absent from the decision-making processes of various systems, it frequently leads to recommendations that are fueled by stigma and labeling that then leads to disconnects between Black youth and social institutions, right? I'll now turn it back to Amina.
Thank you, Dr. Anuchet. I'll be covering two issues. The first is anti-Black racism in the education system, and the second is anti-Black racism in child welfare system. But a lot of what I have to say will be focused on education. And I'll start out with a quote from Taibu Healthcare Center, and which I found real relevant. It goes, starting with education, the education system, it is the first entry for children into systemic racism. From early education stages, Black children are faced with inequity. From there, other systems get involved. And I find that to be true. Black children and youth in this report feel unaccepted and disconnected to the education system for various reasons. And most of that is rooted in racism and systemic oppression. And what does this mean? And when we think about all of these terms, and it means that they're disenfranchised and alienated from getting a proper education. Ontario Black community describes schools as site of contention, where Black children and youth and families experience painful everyday racism from either teachers, administrators, counselors, and their peers. And the curriculum and lesson plans don't help either. They're exclusively focus on Eurocentric values and histories that devalue, belittle, and erase Black identities and cultures. I remember when I was in the 9th grade in my geography course, and we were learning about all these different countries and all over the world. And when it came to Africa, the continent of Africa, my teacher referred to it as a country. And then she made like weird, dismissive comments, and I was kind of confused because I spent a majority of a part of my childhood in Kenya, and I understood that, the portrayal of Black children is very limited to like those Save the Children ads, and that was not accurate. And my parents made it a point to educate me about colonialism and the history of Kenya and all of these things. So I already knew all this information, and when I challenged her, she silenced me with her authority. And what could I say? She was the teacher, but she was also providing misinformation. So this is where anti-Black racism is rooted in education. And within that, by silencing me, I learn about microaggressions. Black youth face microaggressions from people in positions of power that either frame them, as Dr. Anisha said, as troubled, troubling, as problems, and less likely to succeed. Therefore, they're not worth the investment, and they can't succeed academically. As one of the quotes on the slide says, one community member mentioned that a Black youth is oriented towards a college even if he wants to study. And that's a result of race-based academic streaming, which is an issue in Ontario public schools. And it's prevalent because Black youth are limited to a certain academic level, typically college and applied level courses, which is nothing wrong with it. But if a Black youth wants to attend university, they should be given the opportunity to do so. But instead they are discouraged to pursue post-secondary studies, which limits their overall economic potential and damages as well. Moving forward, I'll touch into anti-Black racism in the child welfare system. And there are three overwhelming themes. The overrepresentation of Black children. Like I said, 41% of children in care are Black. The unmet needs of Black children and the loss of identity of Black children in care. Just to give you another statistic, people of African descent make about 8% of the population of the city of Toronto. That's 8%, that's not much. And like I said, 41% in care. I still am baffled by that number. And children, the whole point of the child welfare system is to support and provide safety to children, but Black children rarely have a positive experience. In fact, they lose protective factors such as cultural identity and compromises them, which compromises them and results in ongoing trauma once they leave the system. So that's a lot of what I have to say. All of these factors contribute to anti-Black racism in our systems. And to address all the other issues, I'll hand it over to Cyril, who will expand on the next two issues.
Thank you, Amina. It's a pleasure to be here. I know that we have some room at the end for some conversation, so I'm going to try to be as expeditious as possible with these points, even though these ones are very loaded as they all are. In this evaluation, people gave some feedback around policing, and it was issue number 6 and number 7 in terms of the top 10. The anti-Black racism in the criminal justice system was identified as number 6, and people were identifying the disproportionate amounts of youth, men and women in the Black community that are subject to unfair sentencing, over policing, and in comparison to other races. And then in number 7, we have the trauma of racialized policing. And so with these points, I know we have a lot of statistics and a lot of information to show the reality of the disproportionality. We have a lot of politicians and people in authority that are starting to speak up, even in the NFL, for example, about some of the racial disparity that was ignored previously. And so the question that we're kind of reflecting and echoing in this discussion is this the moment? Is this a moment for us to really take these circumstances that surround us in pop culture and in media and people listening in terms of politicians to galvanize transformation within these systems? It's very important to understand the history of some of what we're looking here in terms of the criminal justice system. It's unfortunate that these are not new issues, but hopefully we'll create some solutions that will be long lasting. I felt rather than diving into some of the theoretical or some of the academic discourse around the history or current status of policing and the criminal justice system, I want to talk a little bit on like the social psychology. I want to talk even about personal experience. And in the next 2 minutes, I'll share a little bit of my own personal experience as a case study that I'll offer for people to learn a little bit about what this looks like on the ground, so to speak. So the overall issue is that we are, as citizens, subject to a system that is authorized to police us, that has the power over our life and death, whether that be imprisonment or literal passing away by force. So with that, we are expecting certain protections, certain service, and historically the Black community not receiving that has definitely been the cause of some of the grievances that are being aired in the protests. And I believe this is a cause for humanity, right? And the humanization, and that's why allyship is so important. And so personally, as I subscribe to these expectations of society, my own examples as somebody that doesn't drink, as somebody that I've never experimented with any drugs, I've not been convicted of any crimes, and that's, my own track record. And that doesn't mean that I could have not been convicted in any other circumstance, right? So it's not to stigmatize people that make other choices or have not had the grace to be excused of making choices that were maybe harmful to somebody else due to over policing in the Black community. So with that aside, I've painted a picture of somebody that's bought on to the expectations of these social contracts. And my experience with police officers, so if you're a law-abiding citizen with less deviation, would you expect to have less encounters or negative encounters with police officers? I would say the majority of us might position that, yes, that would be a reasonable expectation. But I could tell you about the time when I was running to my to catch the bus for my last examination in my undergrad, and police officers pulled up to me, they tripped me, put a knee on my back, pressed me into the ground and held me. I was asking, hey, can I go? I have an exam to write. So for my mindset, my only thing was, I know this is a mix-up. I need to get to my exam. I need to finish this thing off properly. And I'm running a little bit late. And all I was trying to do was de-escalate for the sake of the police officers so that I can go on with my day. And that didn't happen for quite some time. I even asked for a ride and they're like, no, just, go off. Members in my community saw me and they're like, hey, what happened? You should take badge numbers. And so instead of looking over my final notes on the way to write my final examination, I was writing a police report. All right. And that's just like one little instance where there were some issues, and that issue was further compounded in terms of the struggle in the process of trying to go through the report system. I can recall driving up to Algonquin Park with my nephew. We were just going to do a nice little road trip and we were pulled over by a police officer for no reason. And this police officer is an older white gentleman. He went to the passenger side where my nephew was. He looked in the car and saw the flashlight handle and thought it was a gun. I can recall where dear friends, I'm holding someone back because he's so enraged because a police officer was picking him out of a group of jaywalkers and embarrassing him in front of his wife and his mother and belittling him. And once we came together, he felt like a lot of rage and he wanted to go and address the officer and ask, like, why have you done this? And it was literally a point of attention of holding back and knowing that this might be saving someone's life because of those types of interactions. I can go on with many, many stories. I'll throw in a bonus one. I was in the parking lot and apparently somebody called the police on me because they felt I was in the parking lot too long. I was just leaving a production. I was getting my bearings before I was leaving. And the police officer pulled me over because there was a call of me leaving a parking lot. And I had some yogurt and a spoon in the car. He saw the spoon and was like, okay, can I see that please? Because he thought I was doing drugs and that was part of my drug paraphernalia. I mean, in the report that I found of the officers describing me when they pulled me over and threw me to the ground, they described me as a Black male with a cell phone and a diamond-studded earring. I never had my ears pierced. It's the perception of law enforcement agents who we are giving authority over us and we're entrusting to serve and protect that are often in a position to abuse power. Is this a little petty, I guess, repercussion against bad cops? No, it's not. This is not an isolated incident. It's a culture of anti-Blackness. And when we talk about solutions and moving beyond some of these challenges, I want to start framing in our minds, what does it mean to respond to anti-Blackness in a way that's not always counter and deficit? Now, I'm going to leave it there because we have so much to go through and we're kind of already running on time. But I want us to think about these things as we go through the remainder of the presentation. I'm going to hand it over to Clementine.
I'll jump in here and share my own experience. When we think of getting profiled, it doesn't occur to you that you can actually get profiled on a university campus by York security, and I've been profiled a couple of times on at the main campus by York security. And I'll explain one, the most recent experience I had. If people know where the School of Social Work is, we're on the 8th floor in South Rose building. There's a glass door. At a particular time in the evening, that door locks. So one day I had an event, finished my event, I was waiting to be picked up. So I sat inside the School of Social Work in the hallway. I sat there, I had my laptop with me, I had my bag there. And then suddenly, 2 York security, they came, they were at the door. And I could see how I looked. The guy was, frantically trying to open the door, and I looked, and then he brought out his key and he swiped, and he came in and he rushed towards me. And I'm like, what's the problem? He's like, you can't be here. I'm like, why? He's like, well, because this place is only for people who work here. You can't be here. I looked at him. I'm like, well, if this place is for only people that work here, then I guess I'm in the right place. He's like, what do you mean? I'm like, I'm a professor. And you could have seen his face. He was so shocked. He's like, oh, I showed him my identification. He was like, oh, I'm so sorry. And I told him, I said, what really upsets me is not just that I was profiled, but what if actually I was a community member and I didn't have, is that the way you'll interact with a community member? How about approaching someone and saying, can I help you? They've closed, the place is locked. Are you waiting for someone? Why just rush to someone? So he sees me, an older Black woman, and he thinks, oh no, she doesn't belong here. She doesn't belong. And one of the things we heard consistently from some data we analyzed, we got the carding data from Toronto Star. They turned it over to us a couple of years ago, and we focused mainly on youth. And we realized that Black youth are more likely to be stopped and carded when they are seen as out of place. So when they are downtown, they're in Rosedale, they're in certain neighborhoods where people think that Black youth shouldn't be. So this York security, he saw me, he didn't think I belonged there. I wasn't the kind of person he was expecting to be there. So yeah, that's, so sometimes we think that the profiling is really only by police, but even security in places that are seen as safe places participates. Clementine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cyril, and thank you, Dr. Anuja, for sharing those lived experiences. I know that they are not easy to share, but they are definitely difficult conversations that we need to have in our community. I'd like to briefly talk about poverty and economic barriers, just relating back to Amina's points about anti-Black racism in the education system. Black people continue to face higher unemployment gaps in Ontario, and we face discrimination based on where in the city we live, our physical appearance, such as our hair or clothing, the color of our skin, and even our names. There's a quote that I would like to highlight in the Doing Right Together for Black Youth report that says that students who, quote unquote, whiten their resumes get 2.5 times more callbacks. That's 2.5 times more chances at employment. And for Jamal to be considered equal to Greg, he needs 8 more years of experiences. Personally, from my own lived experiences, I can say there have been times where I felt incapable of attaining a meaningful high-income job despite being an undergraduate student at York University. The main takeaway from this is just for us to really recognize that poverty is a major, major, major systemic barrier faced by Black youth in Ontario. It limits our self-esteem, it limits our ability to believe in ourselves, and it limits our ability to believe that we too can enjoy the same freedom as our peers. On the 9th issue, which is mental health, Black youth are disproportionately affected, as Amina stated. When you examine the Regis case in Toronto, she was an Afro-Indigenous woman whose mother made a call to Toronto police for assistance to take her daughter to the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, but somehow ended up falling from her balcony while police were in her apartment. I can't go into the details of the case because they have not yet been released to the public, but there are clear patterns. There are clear patterns of racist encounters with Black people and the police. There are clear patterns of lack of mental health support for Black communities. Not only are we stigmatized for having mental health issues in the first place, but there's also another layer of systemic racism we face when seeking mental health care. There's not enough acknowledgement of mental health issues in the Black community, and because of that, there's a huge problem of underutilization. I think when you link both issues of mental health and poverty and economic barriers, challenges for people with severe mental health issues are very much intensified when they're also economically at a disadvantage. And what I mean by that is when people do not have the economic resources that they need, or they're working multiple low-wage jobs to survive, that comes at a deterioration of their mental health. There needs to be definitely more conversations, there needs to be more awareness, and there definitely needs to be more structures that encourage Black communities to utilize the mental health services that they so rightly deserve without fear of discrimination or stigma. I'm going to pass it over to Cyril quickly, and he's going to talk about the overall well-being of Black youth.
Thank you so much. I saw the speed of the presentation just ramping up, and definitely want to make time for people to share questions. So forgive me for not doing this justice, but this report is published and the conversation, of course, continues. We want to highlight the importance of well-being of Black youth, families, and communities. Understanding the historic division of Black families, culture, and understanding the disconnections between intergenerations. These are things that the Black community has been very active in solving amongst themselves. For example, like rites of passage programs and cultural institutions and places of business that have been celebrated for decades. So while these are big issues in our community in terms of systemic legacies of oppression and separation, the Black community has continually found ways to self-heal and regenerate, even though there's been little to no attempts for reparation in terms of repairing damaged relationship with allies and state authorities. And so I'd like to call that out for sure. I'm going to advance to the next slide just to keep things rolling. As we start talking about action, and we start talking about dismantling anti-Black racism, I want to come back to that framing of anti-Black racism. And I guess a disclaimer, I'll speak for myself, maybe not for my colleagues, but the idea of anti-Black, I'm starting to remix it in my mind, and I've talked about this elsewhere, around what does it mean to start talking about pro-Black? And does that, become scary for people? Instead of framing things always in a deficit and framing, like, it's very important to understand the issues and talk about the issues, but there's been so much resistance, so much resilience from the Black community, and that is not shining through. One of the top issues was not a lack of recognition of excellence, and there's so much excellence there. So if we can start by reaffirming the humanity that is constantly suppressed and repressed, then that's a start. So I want to talk about what does it mean to have a pro-Black understanding in terms of celebrating. This is not to say there's a hierarchy of Black being higher than other races. This is talking about the word pro in terms of being for, in terms of being a proponent of a culture and a people. And that's not in opposition. And that's often a problem I see. And maybe we'll get to this in the questions in terms of how people constantly refer to when Black people try to do for self. Can we go to the next slide, please? They start to be framed in a way of being against someone else. And so looking for self-determination and agency, I would say this is a place. If allies want a place to be able to support that's fruitful, that's productive, I would say sometimes it means stepping out of the way. Sometimes it means sharing resources. There's a lot of work that's been done on this, but centering this force around self-determination for the community to do for self, instead of being in a position where we always have to ask, will you recognize that my life also matters? It feels kind of ridiculous to start with as a starting point. So, I mean, getting beyond that, instead of just this reactionary thing where we do this a few times a year like a ceremony, let's then look at the humanity across all peoples and value what they're saying for themselves. And when we have that urge to fear this idea of pro-Blackness, for Black communities that have been so disenfranchised and marginalized consistently, systemically, culturally, maybe we should check ourselves. What can we do for the Black community, even if that means getting out of the way and not centering my own story? I'm going to leave it there because we want to get to questions and a little bit more.
I love that, Cyril. I really love that. Just putting that out there.
Thank you, Cyril. And absolutely, I agree with all your points. And just to kind of segue into the education system and microaggressions, which is something that I talk about all the time and a passion of mine. But I just wanted to kind of highlight something that I came across this weekend, which was the Black in the Ivory hashtag in the United States. And just to connect to what Dr. Anusha said about being profiled regardless of your status or your accolades, regardless of you're going into a building and you're a professor and you're still profiled. And that's the hashtag allowed so many academics and professionals in STEM and to kind of share their stories, even though they were, well-renowned authors, writers, contributors, scientists, all that stuff. And they were the first in their program to either graduate from that program or teach in their program. They still faced microaggressions. They still faced daily discrimination, and which resulted in some form of trauma. And a lot of them continue to push through because they knew either they were the first in their field to accomplish whatever goal that they were trying to accomplish. And they knew that that would open doors for other people, so they continued. And that really struck with me because I don't think they should have to do the work alone. And that's why I think that microaggressions and anti-Black racism in the education system exists at every level, from primary to the post-secondary. And we should start addressing it when when it affects our Black youth during their earliest years. And one of the recommendations or like actions that I think are really important is like redesigning the curriculum of Ontario schools to be inclusive of Black histories, cultures, and accomplishments. We need equitable education practices and complete overhaul. And like Cyril said, shift from the deficit perspective of Black youth. Invest in them culturally. We need to celebrate Black excellence and ensure we double down on graduation rates, paid internships in every sector, in every industry, and everybody has to be involved in order to make this happen. Expand on Black youth's notion of what is possible in their education and in their careers, and tackle the violence of low expectations. And I want to highlight that point, the violence of low expectations, because that is what anti-Black racism in the education system is. It is the violence of low expectations. And I'd like to kind of finish off with a quote that I thought was really relevant from the Towards Race Equity in Education report that I thought was really great. Is it says, Black students are capable, as competent, as creative, and as determined as other students. The ways that Black students are constantly misjudged and mistreated by teachers and guidance counselors is an injustice to our community. I agree wholeheartedly with that statement. It's time for us to shift the narrative and invest in their future. I'll turn it over to Dr. Anuche to discuss the next slide.
Yeah, I was going to talk about the importance of an intersectionality lens in framing the work we do, but I can see we're over time. So perhaps I'll wait and then we can come back. We'll take some questions. Kyrie, what do you think? Turn it over to you so we can get into the questions. And if we have time, I can come back to this.
I think that would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Look, this moment in time has been hundreds of years in the making, and we're certainly not going to unpack it in a webinar. There is so much critical content in your report. My colleague is going to share the link to that report with the audience. My colleague's going to share the link to the report in that audience. So much good content, critical stats, and your personal stories. Change would look like content from your report and your stories being the headlines as opposed to the nonsense that came out of the mouths of some of our politicians about racism in this country. I mean, really. Anyway, we have over 200 people with us here today, 200 and change, 211, and we have a lot of questions. People are keen to connect with you and to get more of your insights. So we're going to get right into it. And again, you should be getting, audience, a link to YouthREX's report, which has a lot of the content our panelists were speaking to. So we'll just start with a question. How can one show up in solidarity with the Black community? What are examples of helpful allyship? And Cyril talked about this a little bit, and counterproductive allyship.
Okay, I'll start then. So in terms of allyship, there are a lot of resources and advice and tips about how you can be a great ally. I think one thing that I'll take away is not putting too much burden on the group you're supporting to educate you on how they can be supportive, number one, which is kind of ironic for this conversation, but that's the point of our dialogue, to open up ways that people can start to look at these reports, do the research themselves so that they can be more informed when they're supporting. And then the other thing is, I would say, challenge your concept or idea of like humanization. We've all grown up in this world, and many of us in this particular society, where we've had a latent education of anti-Black racism ingrained in many of our institutional, cultural, social experiences. That includes people in the Black community, where we learn to not be for Black communities and be for ourselves, but rather be against. And if we are thought about to be not of the Black community, we see some exceptionalism as, oh, you're not like one of them, in terms of this toxic idea of what it means to be Black, that lowercase b Black, in terms of that cultural construct, that social construct, in opposition, like that's abnormal creation in terms of how it's been framed. And there's a lot of history and conversation to go into in terms of what I mean by that. But again, revisiting humanism, can you see yourself in the other person? Can you treat that person the way you would want to be treated? If you don't understand everything, because empathy is not realistic if you haven't walked in those shoes, realize your limitations and maybe ask if you're crossing boundaries. I'm going to leave it at that. Again, there's a lot of information out there, but I'm sure there are a lot of other questions.
Yeah.
I'll also jump in and talk about what allyship, advocacy at Allyship means to me. And I think for me, it goes beyond having conversations with people you already agree with. I think that's a big step, because sometimes, you know, we can be like it means having conversations with your family members, coworkers, and people outside of your circle and educating them. And also it means going beyond symbolic gestures, because in order for those symbolic gestures to have meaning in the future, they have to be followed up by action, right? So we need to reimagine more inclusive policies and destroy, you know, practices that reinforce anti-Black racism in every institution. And like Cyril said, it exists in every institution. And to me, it's about collective responsibility to destroy anti-Black racism in every aspect of our society. If we all take a collective responsibility to take this on, then I think it's possible. But yeah, that's all I have to say about the topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Cyril and Amina. Another question, and this question certainly resonates with me. How are you making sense of this time personally so you can keep going, like coming here today to be panelists for this conversation?
Yeah, thank you, Kyra, for that question. And when all this started and we got together as a team, as a YouthREX team, all of us, students, staff, interns, and several of us are Black. So one word we felt kind of described how we're all feeling was tiredness. You know, yeah. It's like, you're tired. There we go again. You know, this again, 2020, you know, and this is coming from COVID that has also revealed all the systemic issues. For me personally, there's also an aspect, I went back, my grandfather in 1930 wrote a chapter on the color prejudice he faced, you know, during colonial times. So it's like 1930, he experienced this, and I'm here, I'm talking about this again. But then mixed with that tiredness is also the commitment, the conviction that, you know, we just need to, keep doing this, keep talking about this. And for me personally, and I tell social work students, I'm like, when I look at how much progress we've made on every single issue, whether it's around sexism, racism, homophobia, you look at where we started, then you're like, wow, we've come a long way. That means we can go even further. You know, when you look at that, rather than saying we have all this way to go, you're like, here is where we're coming. We made these shifts. We need to keep on moving. And, you know, like what you shared, Kyra, your own personal experience, I think we're all doing this because it's personal, you know, we are invested. I don't want, in 1903, W.E. Du Bois, he the souls of Black folk, I think the quotes I keep on going back to, he talked about being asked, how does it feel to be a problem? 1903. But then in 2020, I think my son is still getting the same kind of question. It wouldn't look out of place if someone asked Cyril or Amina or Clementine, how does it feel to be a problem in 2020? You know, so hopefully our work will lead to trying to make sure that maybe 2020 will be the year that some of these things will make this big progress or shifts. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. A question from Kimberly Nesbitt. Her question is, how can we be more specific about the changes we would like to see? How can we take action as Black communities to bring about the outcomes that we would like to see? Moving through issue framing and problem definition into the development and implementations of solutions.
I'll start and then others can jump.
Please.
If you look at the reports we did, the Doing Right Together for Black Youth, we also released 13 multi-sectorial calls to action, that we're urging all our stakeholders to get behind for the full implementation. These calls to action, they are not new. A lot of the solutions that the action that needs to be done, they are not new. They all echo, reaffirm those from previous consultations. So we'll post a link to so that people can take a look, but they are very specific, starting from what you need to do around whether it's being pro-Black, like Cyril described it, or within the educational system, within the child welfare system. You look at the child welfare system, we've just had the extensive work that was done by One Vision, One Voice, extensive work. They have all the policy recommendations. They are out there. So within every sector, there are very specific, concrete recommendations that have been made. And that's why one of the things we started with is urging people to be fully engaged. Take the time to get to know all these recommendations. Take the time to know what the issues are. And then look at where your sphere of influence is. We all have different things that we can do. Because sometimes people will be like, well, I'm not a politician. Well, I'm not a policymaker. Well, whatever your sphere of influence is, if it's within your home, if it's within your office, if it's within your ministry, ask questions, be an ally, think about what you can do, and everyone can do something. And if we all do, then this moment we're in, this will be the one that's where we can make that big shift, right?
I'd like to share some ideas and just preface really quickly the idea of like pro-Blackness, for example. Not all white citizens in Canada are hyphenated citizens, so to speak. They're not called European or Ukrainian Canadians. So as an African Canadian or African American, we're realizing that there's structures that alienate us from a sense of ownership or belonging to the land. Myself, I'm a 7th generation Black Canadian on my mom's side from the Loyalist history in Nova Scotia, and still I will be othered and made to not necessarily fit into this narrative. And so when I talk about this idea or concept of a pro-Blackness, it's not as easy as saying, well, what about pro-whiteness? Are you for pro-whiteness? It's not as easy as that, because we have to recognize the systemic structures there. So I want to throw it out there because I can get a sense that a lot of people are going to start flipping to that reactionary, reverse racism argument that's done some conversation. So I felt it was important to just put that out there while we're in this conversation. And in terms of a place to start, knowledge of self. That's the first place. Knowledge of self, seeing yourself in others, and moving for a sense of self-determination with your community.
Thank you for that. And I will share, we have, like I said, over 200 people in the audience. We have a lot of questions. And I'm so sorry saying now we won't get to all of them. We're going to go a little bit over time to try to fit as many in as we can, because there's just a lot of questions. Continuing with a question from Urshane Khalid. I've been reflecting on PR statements that large corporations have been putting out to save face, cookie cutter responses that have become so normal that most people have them memorized. But normal, he says in quotes, isn't working in confronting these issues. What shift in language do you think is needed to confront anti-Blackness and racism in our corporations and institutions?
Thank you so much for that question. I too have been looking at all those statements and I can't stop laughing.
It blows my mind.
Yeah, some of them is obvious that whoever is signing off on them did not write it themselves, right? They have a comms department who writes it, and and I saw a tweet that says that all these companies they have more statements and posters that they even have Black employees, So yeah, I think people have also, people are catching on. People have started calling people up on the statements and saying the statements and just a statement is not good enough. I know within our own institution, people are doing that. We've put out a couple of statements and people are pushing back and saying, well, in addition to these statements, we need some concrete actions. We need you to commit to concrete actions. Yeah, and I think we all need to do that. We need to do that. Again, trying to remind, I mean, the issues seem so big, but we need to keep on reminding ourselves that sometimes all it takes is one, just a little bit more, just a little bit more push, and then something crumbles, something changes. So just a little bit more, holding people accountable, asking them, what does that mean? What does that mean in very concrete terms, right?
Yeah. Yes, and I mean, this is the reaction is unprecedented. Like, we've just never seen this before. That kind of alignment from companies and organizations, and yeah, what does it mean? So we are at time, and we have so many questions from the audience, all of which we have. I'm going to move into our closing remarks. But before I do, is there anything that anybody else wants to add before I go into our closing remarks?
I can wrap up what we have to say. And I think just kind of echoing what everyone else is saying, I think if what Dr. Anucha said about organizing, educating, and mobilizing within our sphere of influence, I think that's the biggest takeaway. I think a lot of times we can be kind of like stuck. We're like, what can we do within our community? And I think that's the start. And for me, I just want to kind of leave everybody, because we are out of time, with my favorite quote by political activist, author, and academic Angela Davis. And I keep this in mind every single time. The quote goes, I feel that if we don't take seriously the ways in which racism is embedded in structures of institutions, if we assume there must be an identifiable racist who is a perpetrator, then we won't ever succeed in eradicating racism. So I think shifting that narrative, instead of just looking at people, let's look at the structures. And I think I remind myself all that time. I remind myself of that every single time. So I'd like to just finish off with after that. So yeah, thank you.
Dr. Anucha, Cyril, or Clementine, anything you'd like to add? Thank you, Amina.
I would say that it's important for everyone here listening to understand that there's a large Canadian context when it comes to the oppression of Black communities. It's an international context. It's a colonial history. It's a neo-colonial reality. And let's definitely give credibility to the voices that have been advocating for so many years for systemic changes, because the answers are there. They just need resolution and a level of seriousness to acknowledge what's already been discussed and what we're determined to do in the future.
And just to end off, I just want to say that as we, try to find the solutions or speak up and do all the things we're doing in our own respective fields, it will get tiring, it will be exhausting, but just remember that, as Dr. Anucha said, the fight is just, we've come so far and there's so much more to go, and just keep on keeping on, I guess. Thank you, Kira.
For me personally, I look at people like Amina and Clementine and Cyril. I look at them and I'm like, wow. I'm like, the future is bright. And so many other young Black, doing the best they can, articulate, brilliance, visionary. For me, I look at them and I'm like, we're in good hands. Yes. Eventually, people can only delay, but eventually it is coming. It is coming. And I'll share this story. I ended up not being saying my piece around intersectionality. Yesterday, I was on a Zoom call and I mentioned intersectionality. I'm like, it was developed by Black feminist scholars. And after the call, my 18-year-old who is in grade 12, she came to me and gave me this big lecture. She's like, Mom, next time you mention that, make sure you mention Kimberly's name. Who is a Black, mention her name. Black women need to get the recognition they deserve for their ideas. So, we're in good hands. It's going, whether this is I hope this is the moment, but even if this is not the moment, that moment is coming, because they are coming. They are coming. There's no stopping them, right? They are coming. Change is coming, for sure.
And just to add on to that, I'll give the last words to Dr. Nutra. And you know, this politics of respectability and how you sound, I don't think is what we're trying to capture, right? You don't have to necessarily have accolades and titles and sound a particular way to deserve value as a human being. And the intersectionality from Professor Crenshaw that's being recognized is so important to incorporate in terms of a Black feminist perspective and understanding and theorization. Would you agree, Dr. Nutra?
Oh, definitely. That's we didn't have the time to talk about how we can't adopt a very singular understanding of Blackness. You know, there's a lot of diversity within Blackness, and when you adopt that singular understanding, then it becomes you're almost caricaturing what being Black means, and that's the importance of our work and other Black feminists who have pushed us to understand those intersections, right? How the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, your histories, how they all come together to shape your identities. And, you know, and how those, the diversity is a beautiful thing. The fact that on this panel now, we're, how many of us? 5, my counting is a little bit off. 5 Black people, but we're all different. We all have our own histories, and they should all be acknowledged and recognized. They shouldn't be flattened, right? Would you agree, Cyril?
They should be celebrated, and
Exactly.
we're all human, so that humanization is a project that everybody has a responsibility to reaffirm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to YouthREX. Thank you to each of you for your work and your personal stories and your time today. We really, I really appreciate you coming. And this certainly isn't the end of the conversation of race in our series. So stay tuned. And to all of you in the audience, thank you for your questions. Before we say goodbye, we do have one last question for you, and this really helps us to inform our planning going forward. And the question is, what is your interest in attending Scholars Hub at home during the summer months? If you could take a quick moment to give us that feedback, and to continue to bring relevant current content. We want to make sure we bring it to you in the right time. Thank you so much for participating in that. Feel free to share today's talk with your friends. It will be posted on all of our social channels. So be sure to follow us at York Alumni on Twitter and Insta. You can also join our LinkedIn group or follow us on Facebook by searching York University Alumni. And feedback about this today or any of our program is always welcome and can be sent to us directly on our social channels or at alumni@yorku.ca. Please join us for our next Scholars Hub at Home lecture taking place live on Wednesday, June 17th at noon, featuring Professor Jennifer Hindman speaking about vaccine geopolitics during a global pandemic. We hope to see you all there. Thank you again for being with us today, and keep well.